In the year 865 AD, Europe was on the verge of witnessing an event that would forever change the history of the British Isles. For over 7 decades, the Vikings had honed their tactics of navigation, raiding, and warfare. Now, all that experience was converging into an unprecedented expedition. For the first time, a massive coalition of Scandinavian warriors would not be crossing the North Sea merely in search of gold or silver. Their goal was conquest. In the fjords of Norway, along the coast of Denmark, and across various Scandinavian communities, preparations had begun many months earlier. Shipyards worked ceaselessly. Centuries-old trees were transformed into ships. Blacksmiths forged swords, axes, spears, and arrowheads in unprecedented quantities. Farmers set aside tons of provisions to sustain a long campaign, while families bade farewell to those who might never return. The difference between this expedition and all previous ones was clear. The Vikings did not plan to return at the end of the summer. Northumbria dominated the north. Mercia controlled much of the island's center. Wessex was emerging as a rising power in the south. Alongside them were East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex, each ruled by its own kings and nobles. This fragmentation was the invaders' greatest advantage. Viking leaders knew it was unlikely that all the kingdoms could act as a single nation. Ancient rivalries, border disputes, and internal conflicts hindered any coordinated response. When one kingdom came under attack, the others were often slow to react. The Scandinavians had studied this situation for decades. Now, they were ready to capitalize on it. As the massive fleet departed Scandinavia, hundreds of white sails appeared upon the cold waters of the North Sea. Long ships sailed in formation, propelled by the wind and the synchronized rowing of their crews. It was an impressive display of organization and discipline. After days at sea, the ships approached the east coast of England. The invasion's first major target was the Kingdom of East Anglia. Contrary to what many imagine, the Vikings did not immediately launch a full-scale battle. They acted with caution. They needed to secure supplies. They needed to feed thousands of men. They needed horses to move quickly across the island's interior. The rulers of East Anglia realized they lacked the strength to confront such a massive invasion force. Rather than risk a direct confrontation, they chose to negotiate. According to the chronicles, the inhabitants provided horses and other resources to the invaders in exchange for a temporary peace. This decision allowed the Vikings to further strengthen their position. Now, they were not merely skilled navigators. They could also fight on horseback, covering long distances rapidly and taking their enemies by surprise on land. As they established their first major camp in England, the leaders of the Great Army began to gain renown among their own men. Among them was a figure who would go down in history shrouded in mystery, Ivar, known as the Boneless. His epithet continues to intrigue historians to this day. Some scholars believe he suffered from a physical condition that hindered his movement. Others argue that the name symbolized his extraordinary flexibility in combat, or his strategic intelligence, likening him to a serpent capable of escaping any trap. There are also those who believe the nickname only emerged in the Norse sagas written centuries after the events took place. Whatever its true origin, one characteristic seems clear. Ivar was an exceptionally intelligent commander. Medieval sources describe him more as a strategist than an impulsive warrior. Alongside him were other equally important leaders. Halfdan Ragnarsson, known for his military experience and for commanding large contingents of warriors. Ubba Ragnarsson, remembered as a courageous leader respected among the Scandinavians. Some traditions also mention other chieftains who took part in the campaigns, though not all can be identified with absolute certainty by historians. Much of these commanders' fame is linked to the legendary figure of Ragnar Lothbrok. According to Norse sagas, Ragnar was one of the greatest Viking kings and warriors of all time. The stories claim he led numerous expeditions across England and France before being captured by the Anglo-Saxon king Ella of Northumbria. Tradition holds that Ragnar was thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes and died after days of suffering. Before dying, however, he is said to have uttered words that would forever leave their mark on the Scandinavian imagination. He reportedly declared that his sons would avenge his death. This narrative became one of the best-known stories in Norse literature. However, modern historians make an important distinction. Although there is strong evidence for the existence of leaders named Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, there is no definitive proof that they were all truly the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. It is possible that Ragnar represents a composite of several historical Viking chieftains, whose stories were merged over generations by saga-tellers. Even so, for the thousands of warriors in the Great Army, it mattered little where history ended and legend began. They believed they were taking part in a momentous mission. Many viewed the campaign as an opportunity to win eternal fame. Others sought fertile lands. Some desired wealth. And there were those who genuinely believed they were avenging Ragnar. As the invaders consolidated their position in East Anglia, messengers crisscrossed England bearing alarming news. This was no mere coastal raid, nor was it a small band of marauders. A full-scale army had landed. Anglo-Saxon kings began to muster their warriors. Blacksmiths toiled to forge new weapons. Messengers rode between strongholds. Monasteries hid their treasures. Peasants abandoned vulnerable villages. Fear spread faster than the Vikings themselves. But the Scandinavian leaders were in no rush. They knew that a campaign of this magnitude required planning. Before attacking England's major kingdoms, they needed to secure a solid base, familiarize themselves with the terrain, and carefully observe their future adversaries. It was only the beginning. Before long, their eyes would turn to the north of the island, where a civil war was tearing apart the powerful Kingdom of Northumbria. The Vikings would immediately realize that this internal conflict offered the perfect opportunity to carry out their first major conquest. And it was precisely there that the history of England would begin to change irreversibly. As the Great Heathen Army consolidated its position in East Anglia, its leaders avoided acting impulsively. They knew that winning a war required more than just courage. It demanded an understanding of the enemy, the exploitation of weaknesses, and a strike at the right moment. And it did not take long for the opportunity to arise. To the north, the powerful Kingdom of Northumbria was in the throes of a severe political crisis. For decades, it had been one of the most influential kingdoms in the British Isles. Its monasteries were centers of learning, its cities controlled vital trade routes, and its kings wielded great influence over other Anglo-Saxon peoples. Yet, this strength masked a deep division. Following succession disputes, two men laid claim to the throne: Osbert, a deposed former king, and Ella, who had seized power. Instead of uniting against the growing Viking threat, both sides focused their efforts on a civil war. For Ivar and his allies, this was precisely the situation they had hoped to find. The Vikings had already learned that a divided kingdom was far easier to conquer than a united one. While Northumbrian nobles argued over who should rule, the great army advanced slowly northward. Longships transported men and supplies along the rivers and coast, while mounted detachments traversed the English interior on horses seized in East Anglia. Their movements were deliberate and cautious. The Viking leaders avoided squandering men in unnecessary skirmishes. Their true objective was a city of immense strategic importance: York. Known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eoforwich, York had been founded by the Romans centuries earlier and still retained parts of its ancient stone walls. Situated on the banks of the River Ouse, the city was one of England's major trading hubs, controlling vital routes between the north and south of the island. Whoever controlled York would control a large part of Northumbria. In the autumn of 866 AD, the Great Army arrived before the city walls. The inhabitants were taken by surprise by the speed of the invasion. Unlike the small coastal raids of previous decades, this force was prepared to besiege a major city. The Vikings blocked the main approaches, occupied strategic areas around the walls, and began the siege. Initial resistance was limited. Political instability had weakened Northumbria's defensive capabilities, and the invaders managed to enter York after intense fighting. For the first time, one of England's most important cities fell under Viking rule. News of this spread rapidly across the British Isles. The shock was immense. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms realized they were facing an enemy completely different from the one that had attacked Lindisfarne decades earlier. Now the Vikings did not simply sack a city and leave. They stayed. They built camps. They controlled roads. They administered conquered territories. Meanwhile, The gravity of the situation finally forced Northumbria's two rivals to make a decision. Osbert and Ella realized that if they continued fighting each other, they would lose the entire kingdom. For the first time in a long while, they set aside their differences and mustered their armies to retake York. It was a desperate attempt. In early spring of 867 AD, the Anglo-Saxon forces marched toward the city. Inside the walls, Ivar and the other commanders were already anticipating this move. Instead of sallying out to face the enemy in the open field, they decided to use the city itself as a fortress. They intended to stay in England. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles would come to call this force the Great Heathen Army. Although contemporary records do not specify an exact number of combatants, historians believe that thousands of warriors took part in the campaign, divided into various groups under the command of seasoned leaders. It was a force far larger and more organized than any fleet the English kingdoms had ever faced. Unlike the early raiders, these men brought tools to build camps, repair ships, manufacture weapons, and establish permanent bases. There were artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, navigators, and veteran warriors. The invasion had been meticulously planned. Meanwhile, across the sea, England remained divided into several independent kingdoms. The gates were reinforced. Defensive positions were organized. Archers were stationed along the walls. Every detail demonstrated careful planning. When the armies of Northumbria launched their attack, they encountered far greater resistance than they had anticipated. The fighting was fierce. The narrow streets turned into battlefields. Shields clashed against shields. Axes sheared through spears. Swords gleamed beneath the cold English sky. The battle raged for hours. Amidst the chaos of urban combat, the defenders' advantage became evident. The Viking warriors knew the terrain and could strike from various directions. The Anglo-Saxons, conversely, struggled to coordinate their movements within the city. By the end of the battle, the outcome was devastating for Northumbria. Both Osbert and Ella perished during the fighting. The deaths of these two leaders effectively ended the kingdom's organized resistance. In Scandinavian tradition, this moment took on even greater significance. The sagas claim that Ella was captured by Ivar and executed via the legendary ritual known as the Blood Eagle. According to this account, the victim's back was sliced open, the ribs were severed from the spine, and the lungs were pulled out to form a shape resembling an eagle's wings. This story became one of the most famous images associated with the Vikings. However, modern historians offer an important caveat. There is no contemporary evidence confirming that this execution actually took place. The earliest descriptions appear only centuries later in Icelandic sagas, which often blend historical events with symbolic and literary elements. Consequently, many experts believe the blood eagle may be a mythological construct intended to glorify the vengeance of Ragnar's sons, rather than a historically verified practice. What is historically certain is that Ella died during the campaign, and his defeat marked the end of Northumbria's independence. With York under their control, the Vikings installed a new ruler subordinate to their interests and turned the city into their main base of operations in England. Little by little, York began to change. Scandinavian artisans set up workshops. Merchants began trading furs, silver, amber, iron, and textiles from various parts of Europe. New neighborhoods sprang up. The Norse language could be heard daily in the streets. The city became known to the Vikings as Jórvik. More than just a military headquarters, it would transform into one of the major urban centers of the Scandinavian world outside Scandinavia itself. The conquest of York represented far more than a military victory. It demonstrated that the Vikings were capable of administering cities, controlling trade, and establishing lasting governments. The era of lightning raids was over. Now began the age of permanent conquest. Even as they celebrated their victory in Northumbria, the leaders of the Great Army were already turning their attention to another objective. To the south, the wealthy Kingdom of Mercia watched the invaders advance with growing concern. If Northumbria had fallen, no other kingdom could feel safe. And very soon, the Viking banners would march again. The next target had already been chosen. The capture of York marked a definitive turning point in the history of England. For the first time, a major Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen under the dominion of the Great Heathen Army. What had previously seemed like a series of isolated raids now revealed its true nature, a carefully planned campaign of conquest. In Jórvik, as the Vikings came to call York, life began to reorganize. Scandinavian merchants opened workshops, blacksmiths forged weapons and tools, carpenters erected new structures, and ships arrived regularly, bringing supplies and new settlers. The city was ceasing to be merely a military base and was transforming into a major center of Viking power. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Great Army were already discussing their next move. England remained divided. Although Northumbria had been defeated, the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex remained strong. If they wished to control the entire island, they would have to confront these two powerful adversaries. The first target would be Mercia. Situated in the heart of England, the kingdom controlled vital roads, trading towns, and extremely fertile farmland. Its geographical position made it a key strategic asset for any army seeking to dominate the British Isles. In 867 AD, the Vikings left York and began their march southward. Unlike earlier expeditions, this campaign did not rely solely on ships. Horses acquired previously allowed for rapid movement across the English interior, while long ships continued to transport supplies along the rivers whenever possible. This combination made the Great Army extremely mobile. They could appear where no one expected them, they could change direction rapidly, and they managed to maintain their supply lines even during prolonged campaigns. King Burgred, ruler of Mercia, immediately understood the magnitude of the threat. If he faced the Vikings alone, he would likely suffer the same fate as Northumbria. Faced with this danger, Burgred made a historic decision. He asked the Kingdom of Wessex for help. At that time, Wessex was ruled by King Ethelred, who shared military responsibilities with his younger brother, a prince named Alfred. Few at the time imagined that this reserved young man would become one of the greatest rulers in English history. Alfred was not yet king, but he already demonstrated qualities that caught the attention of his allies. He was deeply religious and scholarly, and possessed uncommon strategic intelligence. Unlike many nobles of the era, he valued knowledge as much as warfare. He spent hours studying religious texts, classical works, and historical accounts, believing that understanding the past helped overcome the challenges of the present. When the request for help arrived, Wessex responded quickly. The armies of Wessex and Mercia joined forces to confront the invaders. It was a significant shift. For the first time since the invasion began, two major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were cooperating against a common enemy. The two armies marched to the fortified town of Nottingham, where the Vikings had established one of their main encampments. The walls protected the invaders, who closely watched every move the English troops made. The Viking commanders were well aware of their situation. They did not need to take risks. Their defensive position favored their men. The Anglo-Saxons studied the fortress for several days. Storming Nottingham would mean facing walls, archers, and warriors experienced in defensive combat. The cost could be enormous. After carefully assessing the circumstances, the English leaders chose to avoid a direct battle. Instead, they initiated negotiations. The result was a temporary peace agreement. According to historical records, the Vikings agreed to leave Nottingham in exchange for payments and guarantees that allowed them to regroup their forces. At first glance, many might interpret this agreement as an English victory, but in practice, the Great Army had achieved exactly what it wanted. The Vikings demonstrated that they were strong enough to force English kings to negotiate. Furthermore, they gained time to rest, time to gather reinforcements, time to plan new campaigns. Meanwhile, Alfred watched everything closely. Even while still a prince, he participated in military decisions and learned an important lesson. The Vikings could not be defeated by courage alone. English strategies needed to be adapted. Armies had to be made faster. Towns needed fortifying. Communication between kingdoms had to improve. Permanent defense systems needed to be created. These ideas remained etched in his memory. In the years that followed, they would completely change how England confronted the invaders. While the English sought to regroup their forces, the Great Army continued to grow. New warriors arrived from Scandinavia. Lesser chieftains joined the campaign. The wealth they had seized funded new ships and attracted ever more volunteers. The invasion was ceasing to be merely a military expedition. It was transforming into a massive colonization movement. Some Vikings no longer intended to return home. They built farms. They founded settlements. They married local women. They established new communities within English territory. Gradually, a new society began to emerge. Norse customs blended with Anglo-Saxon traditions. Old Norse words entered the English vocabulary. New techniques in trade, agriculture, and construction spread across the occupied regions. Scandinavian influence grew increasingly profound. Even so, the war was far from over. The leaders of the Great Army knew that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The Kingdom of Wessex remained in the south of England. Unlike Northumbria and Mercia, Wessex possessed stable leadership, a disciplined army, and rulers determined to resist. Alfred stood out among them. In the years that followed, the young prince would evolve beyond being merely a promising commander. His name would come to represent the last hope of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. While the Vikings prepared new offensives, Alfred studied his enemies. He observed their movements. He learned from every battle, and he understood that defeating the Great Army would require something no other English king had yet achieved. Uniting England, the greatest war of the Viking Age in the British Isles, was just beginning, and the next chapter will reveal the clash between two of the Middle Ages' greatest strategists, Alfred the Great and Ivar the Boneless, a contest that would decide England's future and change the history of Europe forever.